The story of the general begins not with betrayal but with the aura of triumph that surrounded his name, a man whose very presence on the battlefield could strike fear into hardened soldiers. He was more than just a commander, he was a living legend, one who rose from obscurity through raw brilliance and a relentless drive for victory. His earliest campaigns revealed an instinct for strategy that seemed almost supernatural. Where others hesitated, he acted with clarity and precision. His armies moved like extensions of his will, disciplined yet inspired, driven by a loyalty that few leaders in history could command. The soldiers who followed him did so not merely out of duty but out of devotion, believing that under his command no enemy could stand against them. Each victory added to the myth, and soon his reputation spread far beyond his homeland, reaching into the camps of his enemies, where men whispered his name with dread. But glory on the battlefield is a dangerous thing, for every triumph that elevates a general also sharpens the anxieties of those above him. Rulers often desire champions to defend their realm, yet they fear the very power they grant them. In his rise, the general found himself walking a thin line, too successful to be ignored, too beloved to be challenged openly, yet too powerful to be fully trusted. The chronicles describe how he devised tactics that no opponent could predict, using deception, speed, and terrain in ways that made even superior forces crumble. His victories were not accidents of luck but the results of calculated genius, the kind that left rivals marveling and his enemies demoralized. Yet with each triumph, he became less of a servant to his state and more of a looming figure whose influence seemed to rival that of kings and councils. The admiration he inspired among common soldiers and citizens was matched only by the unease of political elites. Men who had spent their lives maneuvering for influence found themselves overshadowed by one warrior's achievements. His presence in court was no less commanding than on the battlefield. When he spoke, people listened, and when he stood, others measured their words carefully. The paradox of his life was becoming clear. The qualities that made him indispensable in war made him intolerable in peace. His sword secured borders, but his reputation unsettled palaces. This tension became the unspoken backdrop of his success, a shadow that stretched longer with every campaign. For the viewer, the drama begins here, at the height of his glory, where admiration and unease coexist in a fragile balance. The general could win wars, but he could not so easily conquer the fears of those who saw in him both a savior and a threat. And yet, he himself seemed unaware, or perhaps willfully blind, to how fragile his position had become. His focus remained on his men, his strategies, and his enemies abroad, not on the whispers in the halls of power. That blindness, or perhaps indifference, would one day cost him dearly. At this stage, however, the story is not yet of betrayal but of triumph. The audience is invited to marvel at a figure who seemed unstoppable, a man whose life reads like an epic, only to be reminded that even the greatest warriors cannot outrun the silent plots forming behind their backs. The seeds of tragedy are already sown, even in the fertile soil of his victories. Power never exists in isolation, and for a man who had risen so high, enemies were never far behind. The general's victories had not only secured his name in history but had also created waves of suspicion among those who sat in gilded halls and fragile thrones. In the world of ancient states, rulers were often forced to balance gratitude with fear, rewarding their champions with glory while secretly resenting the influence that came with such triumphs. For every cheer that greeted the general's return from war, a murmur of unease echoed in the council chambers. Was he a loyal servant who shed blood for his homeland? Or was he a man whose ambition might one day outgrow his obedience? These whispers grew louder with each success, until admiration began to twist into suspicion, and suspicion hardened into fear. Among his fellow commanders, jealousy took root. They had fought their own campaigns, spilled their own blood, but their victories seemed pale in comparison to the brilliance of his conquests. Where they achieved stalemates, he secured decisive triumphs. Where they struggled to rally men, his soldiers would march into fire at a single command. It was not just his victories that provoked resentment but the myth that surrounded him, the way ordinary citizens began to chant his name and ballads were sung of his greatness. Rival generals looked upon him and saw not a comrade but a shadow eclipsing their careers, a reminder that no matter what they achieved, they would always be second best. In the cutthroat world of politics and war, Envy was as dangerous as any enemy on the battlefield. The rulers themselves were no less wary. History had shown them that generals too powerful could turn into kings, that men once hailed as saviors could become usurpers. The court began to read into every gesture, every word, searching for hints of hidden ambition. Was his loyalty genuine, or was he biding his time, waiting for a moment when the throne was weak? To the general, these suspicions might have seemed absurd, even insulting, for he had dedicated his life to service. Yet in politics, perception mattered more than truth, and once doubt crept into the minds of those in power, it became nearly impossible to erase. To silence the whispers, he would have had to diminish himself, to deliberately step back from greatness, but such restraint was not in his nature. He lived for war, and war was the very stage that fed his legend. Around him, the machinery of intrigue began to stir. Letters passed between allies who spoke in coded words about necessary precautions. Rivals shared subtle glances at banquets, measuring who could be trusted to act and who would stay loyal. In ancient courts, daggers were rarely drawn in public. They were sharpened in secret, behind veils of politeness and ritual. The general might have thought himself secure because his enemies had no army strong enough to challenge him directly. Yet he failed to see that power is not only a matter of swords and shields but of influence and deception. The same halls where his victories were once celebrated now echoed with plans of how to curb his power, perhaps through exile, accusation, or worse. For the audience, this part of the story builds unease. We know that the greatest danger to the general is no longer foreign armies but the men he considered allies. As the political storm gathers, we feel the tragic irony that the very state he fought to defend is preparing to betray him. His story now takes on a darker tone, where every smile hides suspicion and every toast might be the beginning of his undoing. The stage is set for treachery, and though the general still marches forward with the confidence of a man undefeated, the trap is already being prepared in silence, waiting for the perfect moment to close around him. The conspirators moved carefully, for bringing down a man of such renown required patience, subtlety, and above all, secrecy. Open defiance would have been suicide. His soldiers adored him, and the people saw him as a living protector. To strike directly against him was impossible, so they turned instead to deception, weaving a net of intrigue so finely spun that even the most vigilant warrior would fail to see it tightening around him. Rumors were their first weapon. Whispers of disloyalty, of secret ambitions to seize the throne, began to circulate. These whispers were not shouted in the streets but slipped quietly into the ears of the powerful, repeated until suspicion felt like certainty. In the politics of the ancient world, perception was often more dangerous than any army, and the conspirators knew that if they poisoned enough minds, the general's fate would be sealed before a blade was ever drawn. They also understood his vulnerabilities. For all his brilliance in war, he was no schemer. He trusted too easily, particularly in those who had once fought beside him. To him, loyalty was earned on the battlefield, where men bled and endured hardships together. But in the courts and councils, loyalty was bought and sold like any commodity, and this blind spot left him exposed. Letters were forged, suggesting communications with enemies of the state. Alliances were rumored, hinting at hidden promises of power should he ever decide to turn against his homeland. Each forgery and falsehood was carefully placed where it would be discovered, ensuring that doubt took root in the very heart of the ruling class. Spies, too, played their role. They monitored his movements, his meetings, even the tone of his conversations. A careless word could be twisted into evidence, a private gesture reinterpreted as a sign of treachery. The general may have sensed that something was amiss, but he dismissed the unease, believing that his reputation and record of service would shield him. After all, who could question a man who had delivered so many victories? Yet that confidence blinded him to the reality that his reputation was no longer his armor but the very weapon being used against him. The greater his legend, the more convincing the argument became that he was destined to reach for the crown. As the plot thickened, even his allies began to hesitate. Friends who had once sworn loyalty now avoided association, fearing that proximity to him might draw suspicion onto themselves. Isolation crept in quietly, as dangerous as any ambush on the field. Without realizing it, the general was being maneuvered into a position where, when the decisive blow came, he would stand alone. The conspirators had no need to outfight him, they needed only to outmaneuver him, to corner him in a game of shadows where swords were useless. For the audience, this moment transforms the tale into a slow-burning thriller. The pace quickens not with battle cries but with hushed voices, secret meetings, and forged evidence that feels as sharp as steel. We sense the dread building as the general's world narrows, his victories now distant echoes while the net around him grows tighter. He is a man who has triumphed over countless armies but who now walks unknowingly toward a danger no battlefield could prepare him for. The trap is nearly ready to spring, and though the general still believes himself untouchable, the audience knows that the silence of plotting is often deadlier than the roar of war. The moment of reckoning arrived not with the thunder of armies but with the quiet inevitability of betrayal fulfilled. The general, whose life had been defined by clarity of command and the certainty of victory, suddenly found himself in a contest where no amount of strategy could save him. Summoned under the guise of loyalty or lured with promises of honor, he walked into the snare his enemies had so carefully set. There was no battlefield this time, no banners, no clash of steel to announce the stakes. Instead, there were chambers filled with accusing voices, documents forged to strip him of his innocence, and allies who once raised their swords for him now lowering their eyes in silence. The man who had never bowed before an enemy's charge was brought low not by strength but by suspicion, not by armies but by whispers. The accusation struck with the weight of spears. Treachery, ambition, betrayal of the very state he had fought to protect, each charge delivered with rehearsed precision, crafted to leave no room for defense. The brilliance of his campaigns, once a source of national pride, was twisted into evidence of arrogance and dangerous ambition. His victories were reimagined not as service but as stepping stones toward imagined kingship. Those who spoke against him did so with calculated fervor, and each word pushed him further into isolation. He stood defiant, denying the claims with the same unshakable authority he once used to rally men into battle, but in that room his voice carried no power. It was as though his greatness had become his greatest crime. The downfall was swift. A man who had outmaneuvered countless enemies on the battlefield now found himself cornered by politics that offered no escape. Some accounts suggest he was arrested under guard, stripped of his command, his loyal soldiers dispersed or reassigned so none could come to his aid. Others claim the blow was even crueler, that he was executed in secret, denied the dignity of a warrior's end. In every telling, the result is the same. The general who had once seemed unconquerable was silenced, erased not by the clash of weapons but by the very people he had sworn to protect. The contrast could not be more tragic. A life dedicated to war ended without a single chance to fight back. For those who remembered him, the shock was profound. Soldiers whispered in disbelief that the man who had led them through fire and thunder was gone, undone by shadows and schemes. To his enemies, it was a triumph of politics over power, proof that no man could rise too high without being cut down. But to history, it remained a bitter paradox, the invincible warrior who lost his only battle in the one arena he never mastered. The emotional weight of this fall lingers because it was not a defeat delivered by fate or foreign foes but by the hands of his own people. The legend ended not in the blaze of glory he deserved but in silence, leaving behind the haunting truth that even the mightiest of generals could be destroyed without a single sword being drawn. The silence that followed his fall was not one of peace but of unease. The conspirators had achieved their purpose, removing the man they feared most, but the consequences of their act soon began to reveal themselves. Without the general, the armies lacked the guiding hand that had made them invincible. Campaigns that once seemed certain to end in victory now faltered, commanders hesitated in the field, and soldiers who had once marched with confidence found themselves unsure. The very discipline and spirit that had thrived under his command began to crumble. His presence had been more than strategic brilliance, it had been a source of belief, and once that belief was extinguished, the cracks spread quickly through the ranks. Beyond the military, the state itself felt the absence. The rulers who had feared him now sat in uneasy triumph, realizing too late that they had removed their strongest shield. Foreign enemies, once cautious and hesitant, began to stir. They had watched the drama unfold from a distance, and they understood the opportunity it presented. Armies that had once trembled at the general's name advanced boldly, testing borders and raiding territories that had long been secure. It was as if his fall had signaled not the restoration of stability but an invitation for chaos. The throne may have been safer from his supposed ambition, but it was now more vulnerable than ever to external threats. Among the people, the echoes of betrayal were even sharper. Ordinary citizens remembered him as a protector, the man who had stood between them and destruction. They had sung his praises, cheered his triumphs, and believed in his leadership. When word spread that he had been cast aside, silenced not by enemies in battle but by the treachery of his own, resentment grew. Stories spread of injustice, of a loyal servant wronged by the envy of lesser men. For many, his death or exile became a symbol of the corruption at the heart of power, proof that greatness was dangerous not because of what it might do but because of how it threatened those already in command. The conspirators had hoped that with him gone, they would be secure. Yet instead, they found themselves haunted by the very act they had committed. The general's memory lingered like a ghost, his absence felt more powerfully than his presence had ever been. Soldiers spoke his name in secret, longing for the days when he led them. Citizens told tales that painted him as a tragic hero, wronged by betrayal. Even within the court, divisions emerged, as some began to question whether silencing him had been a mistake that weakened the entire state. The irony was stark. In seeking to prevent the rise of a man they feared might become too powerful, they had created the very weakness that invited greater dangers. The empire or kingdom had silenced its most feared general, but in doing so, it had silenced its own best defense. The consequences of betrayal now echoed across borders, in the hearts of soldiers, and in the whispers of the people, leaving behind a legacy of regret that no victory in politics could erase. History remembers not only the deeds of men but also the way they fall, and in the case of this general, the legacy is as complicated as it is tragic. To some, he was a dangerous figure, a man whose victories and influence had grown too vast to coexist with the fragile structures of political power. To others, he was a loyal servant, betrayed at the very height of his service by those who could not endure his brilliance. Centuries later, scholars and storytellers continue to debate whether his end was inevitable or whether envy and fear robbed the state of its greatest protector. This ambiguity has preserved his story, turning him into more than a historical figure. He became a lesson, a warning, and in many ways, a myth larger than life. The memory of his fall lingered in the minds of soldiers who had followed him. They spoke of him not as a man undone by ambition but as one sacrificed to the insecurities of rulers. His strategies were studied, his victories recounted, and his leadership became a standard against which future commanders were measured. Yet every mention of his name carried a shadow, the reminder that even the greatest could be destroyed from within. Foreign enemies may have feared his armies, but it was his own people who struck the decisive blow. That irony, bitter and unforgettable, shaped how generations viewed the delicate balance between military power and political authority. The story also outlived its setting, because it touched on something universal. Again and again, across different civilizations, great generals have risen only to be brought down not by foreign steel but by the fear of their own leaders. His tale became one more example of a repeating pattern in history, that the very success that makes a warrior indispensable also makes him intolerable. The cycle of glory and betrayal echoed in the fates of countless others, some remembered as martyrs, others as would-be tyrants whose ambitions had to be checked. In truth, the line between the two is often drawn not by their intentions but by the perspective of those who survive them. For the audience, his story closes with a haunting reflection. The plot that silenced him did not only end the life of a general, it altered the fate of a state, weakened its defenses, and left behind a legacy of mistrust. The silence he left was filled with uncertainty, regret, and the gnawing question of what might have been had he been allowed to continue his service. In the end, his legacy is a mirror, reflecting not just his greatness but the fears of those who could not live alongside it. And so his name endures, a symbol of the timeless truth that the deadliest enemies of great warriors are rarely across the battlefield but often seated in the very halls they swore to defend.